All right. Um, you can probably, well, let me talk a little bit more about who I am. Before going to the University of Georgia, I'm actually from the Midwest, so I'm as my father-in-law used to say, I'm a damn Yankee. From my graduation at the University of Illinois, I was at Fresno State University as teaching research there for 7 years. And then I came to Georgia and put in my 26 years. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. All right, talking about performance horses, the National Research Council has this chart in their nutrient requirements of horses that categorizes exercise as light, moderate, heavy, or very heavy. And there is a more detailed chart of this in the nutrient requirements for horses. So I just kind of summarized what they said. So I'm not going to spend all my time going through this, but basically, most of the people probably that I deal with, clients that I deal with, are going to be in the light to moderate category of horses. And when you look at that light to moderate category, the description that it shows at the top here is the percentage of walk, trot, and canter during the week. And you see for light work, it's considered to be 1 to 3 hours, 40% at walk, 50% at trot, and 10% of canter. And then they kind of give a description of the timed events, the type of events. And again, I'm not going to go through all this. Ashley's recording this presentation. You can look at it, or all you have to probably do is go to nutrient requirements of horses, and you can pull up this chart. Let's go to the next slide. All right. I don't mean to insult anybody's intelligence or background as far as nutrition of the horse, but over and over again, when I work with clients, the biggest thing I find is that they don't understand that the horse, his digestive system, is set up as a non-ruminant herbivore. And that's just a fancy term to mean that the horse's digestive system is really set up to digest forages. And if the horse is not getting enough energy, which I'm going to talk a little bit briefly about in a minute, the nutrients requirements of horses, is then you start feeding concentrates or grains or supplements, however you want to look at it. But again, the main point here is the horse is a non-ruminant herbivore. And the next slide, you can go ahead and go to it. Breaks down a little bit more as far as digestion of nutrients. Notice again that the horse, if you don't already know this, and again, I'm not trying to insult anybody's intelligence or background, is the horse has a very small stomach. You see it says 6 to 12 quarts. And basically what happens in the stomach and mostly in the small intestine is digestion of protein, fat, starch, vitamins, and most minerals. So in other words, a large portion of the digestion of feed that comes from concentrates or mixed feeds, whatever classification you want to give it, occurs in the small intestine. The thing to remember is that this is 70 feet long, but the transit time of those nutrients takes about 90 minutes is all for that small intestine to empty in to the what is considered the hindgut, the cecum, the colon, and rectum. Now, in the hindgut, and this is why the horse is a non-ruminant herbivore, is mostly digestion by the microflora that are present there. And I have down bacteria, but that also includes protozoa, fungi, anything that digests fiber. And mainly what we're talking about here is that this is the production of volatile fatty acids and also the synthesis of B vitamins. Go ahead and go to the next slide. All right. Forage considerations. Again, I may be spending too much time talking about this, but the horse is a non-ruminant herbivore. The horse needs forage, not just fiber. And the main thing is, as we just tried to point out, for gastrointestinal function, normal gastrointestinal function, and also behavior. And a lot of you that are dealing with performance horses, you probably hear and see a lot about stomach ulcers, things like that. Again, if you're feeding the right amount of fiber and going along with the recommendations, and it's the good quality fiber, and I'll talk a little bit more on that a little bit later. How much forage does a horse need? And when I say forage, I mean grass and or hay, pasture and or hay. The horse needs a minimum of 1% of body weight in dry matter. Again, that's a standard recommendation that just about any nutritionist that you're going to talk to is going to tell you that. The next important point about this, and I'll go through an example later on, is that supplementation of a forage or supplementation of a concentrate to the forage diet the horse is consuming should be based on forage quality and amount consumed. The first question I ever ask a client when they call me and they want help putting together a ration or diet for their horse, my very first question is, what kind of forage are you feeding? Or what is your forage program? And how much is that horse eating, especially if they're feeding hay? And 9 times out of 10, you know what the answer is going to be. Well, I feed a flake of this or 2 flakes of that or 3 flakes of that. I said, that doesn't do me any good. Tell me what type of hay and roughly how much weight. Okay. And then I will come together with you and figure out what kind of supplementation with a concentrate feed or supplement that horse may need. Go ahead and give me the next slide. All right. Again, a quick background on nutrients. I like to spend time on this because I also, in my extension work, worked a lot of times with 4-H'ers, so I might regress and consider that when I'm speaking. The most important nutrient, hands down, no matter what people tell you, is water. 60 to 65% of the horse's body weight in a mature horse is water. Intake should be a minimum of 5 to 10 gallons a day. And I mentioned working with the 4-H horse program when I was at the university. We used to do a horse school in the summer in June in Perry, Georgia. Some of those horses that were being ridden pretty hard, because I had all-night watchmen, we were monitoring water intake, and some of those horses were consuming as much as 25 to 30 gallons of water a day. So again, water is the most important nutrient. Don't let anybody tell you different.
Speaking
Now,
of horse school, we're going to try to bring horse school back. That's what I would love to do that.
Good. Energy. Energy is not a nutrient, but energy comes from carbohydrates and fats mainly. Okay. Energy, to me, and any nutritionist that you're going to deal with, energy is the thing that everything else, as far as formulation is concerned, is based on. In other words, how much energy that horse is taking in, carbohydrates and fats in the form of calories, is based upon then protein intake, minerals intake, and vitamin intake. Energy is the determining factor as far as how much a horse will actually eat in dry matter per day. A very concentrated form of energy, the horse isn't going to have to eat as much. A low concentration of energy that you find in some poor forages they're going to have to eat a lot and probably are going to have gut fill before they meet their energy requirements. Protein. Protein, in my opinion and my experience, again, working with clients, is one of those nutrients that's overemphasized. The total body protein of a horse, and a mature horse, is only about 25%. Basically, in a performance horse, what we're looking at is reconstitution of the muscle when they're working, and I'm going to spend some more time talking about that. Minerals. The National Research Council provides recommendations for 14 different minerals. And when I formulate feeds, I generally look at about 16 minerals. Vitamins, basically, we have recommendations from the National Research Council on nutrient requirements for horses for vitamins A, D, E, and the B vitamins, thiamine and riboflavin. And as I mentioned earlier, the horse actually synthesizes a large number of B vitamins that's synthesized by the bacterial or microbial population. I shouldn't say just bacterial, I should say microbial population in the hindgut. And then I put down miscellaneous only because they're not miscellaneous nutrients, but there's been a lot of research done. I still think that the book is out as far as exactly what you need to do with the miscellaneous vitamin or miscellaneous supplements, and I'll mention that a little bit later. Go ahead and give me the next slide. All right. Just like a lot of forage information, I think, is misunderstood by people, energy comes in the form of calories. When carbohydrates and fats are digested, they supply calories, and that's pretty simple. Unless you're a biochemistry major and can sit down and go through the Krebs citric acid cycle, that's pretty much the simplification of it. A calorie is the amount of heat required to heat 1 gram of water 1 degree centigrade. Calories or kilocalories. A calorie, which we see in human nutrition, is the same as a kilocalorie. The capital C versus kilocalories, and that's 1,000 calories. In horse nutrition, we talk about megacalories, which are 1,000,000 calories or 1,000 kilocalories. An example of a 1,100-pound horse, his maintenance or her maintenance energy requirement, according to the National Research Council, and of course, one of the things that I failed to mention in starting all this is we have a lot of individual variation in horses. And that's something that we see in humans too, but there is a lot of individual variation in horses simply because we haven't selected them, like say we have cattle or swine or anything like that for a specific purpose. Maintenance requirements for 1,100-pound horse is considered to be 16,400 kilocalories, or again, what we're talking about is 16.4 megacalories. I'm a pretty easy keeper. I only require 2 megacalories or less of digestible energy in order to not lose weight or gain weight. In fact, probably sometimes at 2 megacalories, I actually gain weight. And I keep telling my wife, who looks at different diets all the time, let's just count calories and how much calories you take in and how many calories you expend. And that's the important thing. Now, I use the term digestible energy. What is digestible energy? Basically, it's the caloric content of the diet going in minus the caloric content of the fecal material coming out. It's that simple as far as horse nutrition. Now, in other species of livestock, we go a little bit deeper than that. But in the horse, we have found that simply putting it on a digestible energy basis, we get pretty close to the energy requirements of a horse. All right, let's go to the next one. All right, how do we know a horse is getting enough energy? Determine adequacy. The most important thing I already mentioned is weight. Is the horse gaining weight or losing weight, or they're staying at the weight we want that horse to be at? The problem is how many people have access to scales that they can weigh their horse? Not that many people. Weigh tapes, they're all right, but I don't like them because you're lucky if they're within 75 to 80%, depending on how you use those weigh tapes. So the next best thing, in my opinion, and mostly what I do in helping people and even in myself, because I don't even have a scale for weighing my horses, is body condition scoring. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. General health, how is the health as far as does it get sick easily? Those kinds of things. Behavior. Does the horse come out every morning ready to go, or they just kind of dragged along? Or when you're saddling that horse up and ready to work them, how does they act? And then the next thing that we look at, which we kind of already alluded to, is how much digestible energy is in the feed. All right, let's go to the next one. All right, in 1983, and I have colleagues and I'm good friends with people at Texas A&M, but they're in the SEC, and so that's a problem with me. But they came out, Texas A&M came out with this body condition scoring system based upon where a horse tends to deposit fat. And they went through this condition scoring system by actually ultrasounding and measuring fat depth on different body condition scores of horses. Where do you look? A horse tends to deposit fat along the neck, along the withers, down the back, around the tail head, over the ribs, and then behind the shoulder. These are the main areas that we look at. I'm going to go through this. Any website that you go to, since you all are web savvy, maybe more so than me, you're going to find, if you type in horse body condition scores, you're going to find all kinds of different charts that people have put together to read easily. And I'm going to show you a little chart in a little bit. Go ahead and show me the next slide. Every morning I get up and body condition score myself. I don't like to jump on the scale. What is the minimum body condition score? Again, this is an individual variation. And one thing that I didn't mention at the very start is we try to make nutrition for horses a science, but there also is an art to it. An art, just like there's an art and a science to training horses, in my opinion, you have to develop a little bit or a lot of an art when you come to feeding horses, whether they're performance horses or any kind of horses. But this is a description of a moderate body condition. And the scores run from 1 to 9. 1 being the thin, extremely emaciated horse. They look like skin and bones. To 9, the fat, obese, roly-poly horse that you probably can't feel bone anywhere on that horse. A moderate condition score, the ribs cannot be visually distinguished, but can be easily felt. Fat around the tail head, beginning to feel spongy, withers appeal rounded over the spinous processes, shoulders and neck blend smoothly. Let's see the next slide. Again, there's, like I said, you can find the actual scoring system anywhere. Everybody has a hero. This is my hero. This horse was, for some of you that maybe follow racing, this horse was Ali Sheba. He earned many millions of dollars. I just put him up because, as I said, he's my hero, and to show you a body condition score of about a 4.5. Now, to body condition score a horse by a picture obviously is very difficult. In my opinion, You have to see the horse and you have to put your hands on that horse to feel over the areas that we talked about as far as the crest of the neck, the withers, down the back, across the tail head, the ribs, and everything else. Let's show the next one.
I will say that my mare has a body condition score of like 6, maybe. Well, okay, you say this is a 7.5. She's definitely an 8. She's chunky. We're both coming off maternity leave, but she never had a foal. She's just fat.
Calories in, calories out. And then work, yeah. All right, here's a 7.5. This actually is the same horse that I just showed you. As he was retired to stud, I think he was about 7 years old in this particular slide. But again, look at the difference in the depth, not only the depth, but the thickness across the crest of the neck. If you palpated around either side of his tail head, you probably feel some fat deposits. His back actually looks pretty good, like it may not have a crease down it, but you can see he's got a lot of padding behind his shoulder and his ribs. All right, let's see the next one. You know, I keep telling everybody that when I body condition score myself and I feel over my ribs, I keep telling myself that is fat and not muscle, okay? There's no muscle over your ribs. Muscle is in between your ribs. And here's this is a brood mare with a body condition score of 5. Okay. Here again, you may be off a little bit because she's a brood mare and she has a little more of a stomach to her. But just to give you an idea, again, there's no way you can do it justice by doing a picture and saying this is a body score like this. Let's see the next one. And I'll let you body score this one. This is one reason I put this up. This is a perfect example of the crease down the back where it looks more like a gutter. And if it rains, you know, the water stands in there, runs in there. All right, let's go to the next slide. I put up this chart. I made this chart up for our students when I was teaching at the University of Georgia, just to give them an easy chart and we go through as an exercise. As I said, one of my areas that I worked in and taught in is reproduction. So I always went through that with them at the start of the breeding season when we were breeding about 25 to 30 mares that the university owned, to look at body condition scores of these horses, score them before and after breeding, and look at conception rates based on that. So just a real simple chart to put together. Go ahead to the next one. All right, all that we just discussed was about energy, okay, adequacy of energy and so forth, and not having access to scales. Ideally, it would be a situation where you would weigh your horse. And a lot of these trainers, they won't admit it, especially racehorse trainers have access to scales and they keep track of that. Protein. We already mentioned the percentage of body protein in a mature horse. In a performance horse, how much protein a horse needs is not that important as a percent. What's important is the total amount of protein. The total amount of protein and the protein quality. In other words, the amino acids and their digestibility. More and more, there's being research done by people that really like to research protein in horses to try to figure out what specific amino acids are going to aid in performance or excess of amino acids. We haven't talked about minerals and vitamins yet, but you can get excesses of minerals and vitamins. The same thing is true about protein. You can get excesses of amino acids. In particular, the first amino acid that most people talk about is lysine, Lysine. And that, if it's in excess, will actually depress appetite in horses. And I did some research in feeding mature or older horses, geriatric horses, if you will. And we found that a lot of the formulated feeds for geriatric horses had excess amino acids. And one of the biggest complaints that I used to get about feeding geriatric feeds to horses was that the horses would go off appetite after a few months. Well, look at the percentage of lysine that was put in those. It was pretty high, and that's one of the reasons that we suspected that those horses would go off feed. Just one of those things again that were excesses. A lot's good, but too much is not. Let's see the next slide. All right. Protein, and this is another big conception. I don't know why it still persists because we talk about it all the time, but protein is not an energy source. It can be an energy source when energy coming from carbohydrates and fats is limiting. It can be, but it is processed very inefficiently. It's digested very inefficiently in the horse. So when I formulate a diet for somebody, if I see that the protein level is above 125% of requirement for that particular horse doing a particular amount of work, I say we need to cut back on the protein, need to change your diet somehow. Sometimes that's not always possible because if they're feeding, say, alfalfa hay as the main roughage, main forage, that can be pretty high. For example, when I was in California, there was a lot of alfalfa fed, and that some of that alfalfa is what I would call dairy quality alfalfa, and it may be 22, 23% crude protein. So it's awful hard to reduce the protein intake when you're feeding that much in the forages, and a large percentage of your diet should be the forage. One reason I don't like to feed above 125% of protein requirement is that water requirements increase. The more protein, excess protein a horse eats, the more they're going to drink water and the more they're going to urinate. Okay. What happens when they urinate more? Is that going to affect the kidneys? Probably not, as long as they're drinking enough water. But they're going to have to drink more water. And the other thing that really irks me is, especially this time of year in the wintertime, and you go into a stable where horses are being overfed protein, and even though they regularly clean stalls and everything else, what do you smell when you walk in? You smell ammonia. Okay, ammonia in the stalls. We know that ammonia stays close to the bedding because it's a heavier compound, and those horses are more likely also to have respiratory problems because of that. My son-in-law has chicken houses, and I used to help him with that once in a while. And you want to really get a smell of ammonia going to a chicken house. Also, with excess protein, you have the increased risk of heat stress. And again, that's partly because of water intake, and also that the inefficiency in digesting protein creates more heat. That's a real simple way to put it. And finally, when you formulate a ration, when you formulate, say, a ton of diet, the most expensive nutrient that you're going to add based upon the feed ingredient that you have to use, and mostly what we're talking about is soybean meal, maybe alfalfa meal, maybe some wheat mid, something like that. But soybean meal, alfalfa meal, those are going to be based upon the amount that you have to put in the diet, in the formulation. It's going to be the most expensive ingredient to add. Let's go ahead, next slide. All right, I'm not going to spend any time on this. I just threw this up because, again, it shows percentages when we're talking about doing a horse doing moderate work, 9.4%. Intense work, 10.3%. It's real easy to meet protein requirements. Again, what we're concerned about is quality of the protein and amino acid concentrations. Let's go ahead to the next one. If I start running close to my time of being over, let me know, Ashley. All right,
Yes, sir.
minerals. Pardon me?
I was just saying, yes, sir, will do.
Minerals, the big thing here is we divide it into macro and micro minerals, salt, sodium, chlorine. Typical salt is added at about 1%, a half to 1% of grain mixes. Salt itself is 30% sodium, 61% chlorine. And that's a good thing to remember because we keep talking about, everybody talks about electrolytes in performance horses, and chlorine is one of those electrolytes that's real important. I'll bring it up again, but always offer salt-free choice, no matter what you're feeding, or if you're trying to do electrolytes, you still offer salt-free choice. Let's see the next slide.
So I have a question about electrolytes.
Okay.
When you're offering electrolytes, I mean, I always have salt-free choice for my horses, but you know, I've read that you want to, maybe increase your electrolytes as the temperatures change, to encourage drinking. Would you say that's true?
In my opinion, if your horse, if you have free choice salt and it's based upon the amount of sweat that a horse produces.
Mhm.
If a horse is sweating heavily, you have the type of performance horse that sweats and loses a lot of sweat, you're losing electrolytes. Then after that exercise, it's maybe a good idea to add electrolytes, but don't put it in, offer it separate from, say, some people like to put it in water. If you do that, do it separate. Have a water without electrolytes and one that you're going to add electrolytes. That's one way of doing it.
Okay.
Or you can buy electrolyte paste. The big thing about electrolyte paste is make sure that it's only electrolytes and doesn't contain anything else in it when you're using electrolyte paste.
Gotcha. Thank you.
The horse conserves minerals, and any excess mineral that you give it, say you give electrolytes before you exercise that horse, there's a good chance they're going to excrete it anyway. All right, we'll go to the next slide. All right, just real quick, some of the main minerals, calcium, go ahead. Next one. Phosphorus. The thing about calcium and phosphorus, and I'm going to show it a little bit in a diet form or a diet formulation that I'm going to put up, is that calcium and phosphorus ratios are key. And this is why it's also important to know what type of forage you're feeding, because some of these forages, say like the legumes, are real high in calcium and low in phosphorus. So the concentrate or the supplement that you feed with that forage, it's real important that you get those ratios correct. Let's see the next one. All right, just a list of some of the main minerals that you're ever going to see on feed tags. Zinc, copper, and selenium are considered micro minerals, as well as manganese, iron, iodine, cobalt. Magnesium is considered a macro mineral, like calcium and phosphorus and sodium and chloride. Let's go to the next slide. Vitamins. One of my pet peeves is many people think they have to add a vitamin supplement. In the formulation that I'm going to show you, or the diet formulation that I just used as an example, fat-soluble vitamins can reach toxic levels. Not so much with vitamin A, but the next vitamin, vitamin D. Go ahead and show that. Vitamin D is generally adequate in most diets if you're feeding a good quality forage and what has been added to commercial feeds. One of the main functions of vitamin D is absorption of calcium and phosphorus. If you've ever been in on an autopsy of a horse that's died from a vitamin D toxicity, you will see tissues that are actually calcified. So if you don't listen to me saying don't overfeed or excess of vitamins, the fat soluble vitamins, consider what I just said about vitamin D. See the next one. Vitamin E. Vitamin E is one of those vitamins that I really like to see pretty high levels in the feed. And the one reason is because it is an antioxidant, it helps with immunity, and it helps with muscle repair in horses that are exercised. Again, good sources are forages, pastures and forages. And this is probably the vitamin that's most likely going to be deficient as far as a fat soluble vitamin. So I tend to put pretty high levels of vitamin E in rations. And generally, you don't have to worry about a toxicity problem, especially feeds that have high amounts of fat in it, or you're feeding extra fat in the form of an oil or whatever. Let's see the next one. Just to mention about the water soluble vitamins, again, if you look at feed tags, a lot of times as a list of ingredients, these vitamins are added. Let's see the next slide. All right, formulating a ration forage based upon intake. We already went through this, and it's just kind of a review to drive the point home. The supplementation should be based on quality and amount consumed. Now, one thing that hasn't been answered in my mind through research, any research, is what is the minimum level of fiber that a horse should have in a diet? We say a minimum of 1% of forage dry matter in the diet, but what is the actual amount of fiber the horse should consume? That's still up in the air. Let's see the next slide. All right. I said it's important that you know what kind of forage you're feeding. This is a slide that is actually a forage report, and if you look at the year, it's quite a ways back, but it is the same thing. This is from the cooperative extension, from the feed and forage analysis, and getting with your county agent, you can have your forage tested, and the main thing is that you have enough forage that you just don't buy your hay from week to week, that you get it from the same source and you know what it is. One of the things that we look at, these are all the different nutrients and so forth, but probably the most important thing to look at is what is known as RFQ, or relative forage quality. This particular sample was 115.5. This was a TIF variety Bermuda grass hay. Okay. When you look at protein, you see that it's not real high in protein, but it's pretty typical for a Bermuda grass hay that's harvested at a fairly decent stage of maturity. The main thing that I'm looking at in this is the digestible energy. We already talked some about this. What it shows is in kilocalories per pound on an as-fed basis. Everybody understands what that is, I hope. That's based upon the nutrient levels as it comes out of the hay, or on a 100% basis is converted. 800 kilocalories per pound on as-fed, 867. Or if you do it in megacalories, it'd be 0.8 megacalories and 0.867. Let's see the next slide.
I just tested some alfalfa and the RFQ on it was 238.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
What was the protein level? Do you remember?
As sampled, it was 21.6.
Yeah, exactly what I was talking about. Okay. Also, it shows not all the minerals that we generally formulate for, but most of the minerals will be shown here. The other thing is nitrates. And one reason I mention this is in cattle nutrition, it's real important not to have high nitrate levels. Fortunately, because of the horse's digestive tract, it can tolerate very high nitrate levels. So we generally never worry about nitrate levels in the horse. Let's see the next slide. So I'm going to call that sample 1. I'm going to show you the next slide. We'll go to sample 2. All right. This actually is a sample from, and I shouldn't say it, but it is a sample that the Department of Agriculture sent me after they confiscated some horses for being in poor body condition, not being taken care of. And this was the hay that they were feeding. And you see the RFQ is 60.7, okay? And down below, when we look at the digestible energy, we see that it's 444 kilocalories per pound. And that may not mean a whole lot to you, that 0.4 megacalories per pound, but straw, straight wheat straw, oat straw, is probably going to have a similar analysis. So this Bermuda grass hay sample was not really any better than straw. Basically, the people were trying to feed these horses straw, and the horses were starving. Go ahead and show the next slide. And also, it kind of shows up in the mineral levels. You see that the calcium level is very low. Generally, the calcium level is going to be 4/10 or higher in average quality Bermuda grass hay. All right, let's go to the next slide. All right, example supplementation. This, I hope, kind of summarizes everything that we've talked about, and that is, we'll put together a diet for a 1,150-pound horse doing moderate work with sample number 1, and then we're going to feed a concentrate with it to meet its energy requirements. Crude protein, remember, was 9.6. RFQ is 115. The important thing here is, again, we base all of our formulations upon digestible energy. On a megacalorie basis, it's 0.87 megacalories per pound. So this is a little bit above average Bermuda grass hay sample. We tend to always think about 0.8 megacalories per pound of digestible energy on average one. And sample number 2, just as a review, I rounded it up just to give it a little more credit to a half a megacalorie, 0.5 megacalories per pound, and an RFQ of 60.7. All right, next slide.
So Dr. Huesner, I don't know if we've made the change officially, but we've worked with the lab to start reporting the digestible energy in megacals. So
Oh, good, good.
for
Yeah, I haven't pulled
horses.
a sample lately and sent it in, so
Yeah.
good. Okay. All right. I showed you a chart at the very beginning that the NRC nutrient requirements are based upon work. This is a chart that I put together a long time ago, even before NRC came out, just to give people a guide on how to start feeding a horse. As far as a horse that was on maintenance, it shows that this horse only requires 1.5 to 2% of their body weight per day, which means you kind of have to have a good estimate of their body weight. And that this horse can survive on no concentrate or grain to a half a pound per pound of body weight. All right, 100-pound body weight, I should say, per 100. A half a pound times 1,000 would be 5 pounds, right? Horse is a maintenance type diet. And the same type of thing. The big thing that I put up here is that I like to come in somewhere in this range on the feeds that I'm feeding for these horses doing light, moderate, and heavy work. Now, heavy work, as we've already kind of shown, again, probably not many people are into heavy, strenuous work, These would be endurance horses, 3-day eventing horses, those types of horses. But those horses may eat up to 3.25% of their body weight in air dry feed per day. That would be, say, hay and grain, or if they're out on a pasture, I mean, they're going to have to consume a lot based upon the water intake. To me, this is a good chart to start with. And again, bringing up the fact that we're dealing with a lot of individual variations in horses, and that's why we kind of show a range. Let's see the next slide. All right, this is kind of maybe a busy slide to look at, but here's our sample number 1 hay, and I put it down to about a 1.4% of the horse's body weight. So this comes out to 16 pounds of hay. And again, this is pounds per day. I need to point that out. This is pounds per day, not pounds per feeding. And come up with a commercial concentrate to supplement that and come up with 8.25 pounds per day, or a total intake of 24.25 pounds. Now, the big thing that it shows there, again, I like to show that it comes up with a percent forage. The percent forage is almost 66%. Again, as a rule of thumb, and again, many nutritionists will tell you this, as a rule of thumb, you want to never go over 50% of the intake coming from a concentrate, a commercial concentrate or grain. Always the bottom limit, in my opinion and my experience, should be no more intake of concentrate and forage. It should be at a 50-50% ratio at a minimum. I hope you understand that point. 50% concentrate, 50% forage intake, whether it comes from hay or pasture or whatever. Okay. Now, again, this doesn't show all the nutrients that I would ever look at, but it shows you the main ones and the ones that generally are shown on most feed tags. Notice that with that intake, this horse is consuming the grain intake. I mentioned the forage intake was 1.4% of the horse's body weight. The grain intake is actually 0.7%, which is great. Another thing that a lot of people say, and I don't necessarily agree with it, but that is on these, say, 1,100-pound horse or whatever, never feed over 5 pounds per feeding. Okay. The big thing that we want to look at right away is not all these figures over here, but are we meeting the nutrient NRC requirements for horses, the minimum requirements? Yes, we are, and in most cases, it's more than a minimum. I try to shoot right at the minimum for determining digestible energy and up or down that as weight and body condition scoring go. The big thing that I've highlighted here in red is that sodium intake. Notice that even feeding this commercial feed, and I'm not going to say what it is. It's not one that I formulated. It's one that I just picked up kind of deal, is that the sodium intake is deficient. It's low. They should be getting almost 19 grams per day and only getting 14. Again, the main reason why you feed or offer salt-free choice. The other thing down at the bottom, just to mention it real quickly, are nutrient ratios. We said everything as far as intake should be based upon energy intake. And this shows nutrient ratios and also the important aspect of calcium and phosphorus. Growing up and going to college a long, long time ago, calcium and phosphorus, everybody always said it had to be 2-to-1, 2 parts calcium to 1 part phosphorus. Actually, what we found, ideal ratios are more like 1.5 to 1.75 to 1 calcium to phosphorus, and that shows that also. And we generally run more than other nutrients because we sometimes run in with minerals conflicting deals. All right, let's see what we have when we do the sample number 2. That'd be the next slide. All right, feeding the same amounts with this forage sample, which I admit I probably picked the poorest forage sample I could just to exaggerate. But here again, feeding the exact same amounts as we did with the hay sample number 1 and the exact same amount of the commercial concentrate, we are only at 80%, roughly 80% of this horse's digestible energy requirements. We said it's real easy to meet protein requirements, even as low a protein as that forage had in feeding a 10% crude protein commercial feed. We're at 99% of that horse's protein requirement. What we don't know is the quality of protein they're getting from that hay. And then again, sodium still deficient. But notice everything else meets requirements. So again, meets minimum requirements. And what we show is percent required. In many cases, the percent required is much more than the minimum required. And so again, to drive home the point that you can overfeed supplements. If you think your horse needs a supplement or some supplement dealer comes along trying to sell you something, it's real easy to get into situations while you're over supplementing. And in some cases, especially with selenium, where you may run into some toxicity problems. And we already mentioned the vitamin D toxicity problem. Okay, let's see the next slide. All right. To me, this particular thing is something that still is very confusing, even to me, reading the limited research that's been done. And that is timing of feeding 2 hours before riding and doing moderate work. Not a lot, some data has come out to say that you should be feeding more like 3 to 4 hours before competition. And it depends upon the type of competition. Trying to piece together as best I can the research and my own experience, if you haven't already figured it out, I'm a real forage advocate. As much forage as I can, even paying for quality forage is real important for the horse. And to me, when I go to shows, when I take my horses to shows, probably what I do is I tend to cut back a little bit on the concentrate that I've normally been feeding them when I'm training or riding them at home. And just pretty much ad libitum hay or measure out the quantities of hay that I give. Now some data show, Ashley mentioned that she's a barrel racer to me before we started. If you're doing 1 or 2 runs with a horse that's expecting a lot of speed, a short duration of speed, basically, if you're real good, you're running under 17 seconds, if you're real good, depending on the size of the barrel pattern, that feeding a concentrate 2 to 4 hours before, along with hay at that 50-50% ratio, might give them some effects, what we call glycemic effects, as far as muscle is concerned, muscle usage. So again, to me, this is something where you need to sit down and try to figure out what your horse does best. What I figured out with the different horses that I've used is that a lot of times these horses get to a show or a competition and they're a little bit reluctant to eat the feed that they normally will suck down in no time at all at home. But if you keep hay in front of them, they do pretty good. And the other thing is, some of these horses, when they get to other different strange places, their water intake goes down. By making sure that they're consuming hay, this will more than likely help with their water consumption too. All right, let's see the next one. I think that pretty much. Just say one thing. I do some consulting. One of the companies I work with is Godfrey's out of Madison, Georgia, just to give them a pitch. I'm not selling their feed. I'm not a feed salesman. I'm a nutritionist, and that's all I do. Go ahead and show the next one. If you have questions or you want more information to help, don't hesitate to email me. And that's my email address there. I still have the University of Georgia email address. It's one of the perks of working there 26 years. They let you keep that thing. So, and I think that's about on time, isn't it, Ashley?
Yes, sir. That was perfect timing. Perfect timing. So again, thank you so much. And guys, for those of you that are on, if you need help, formulating, not necessarily formulating a ration, but if you need help calculating your forage intake for your horses, don't hesitate to reach out. Robin Stewart, she's the extension agent in Lincoln County. She's developed an Excel spreadsheet that you literally just plug in numbers, and it is so great. So if you have any questions about, hay and forage, how to read a forage report, don't hesitate to reach out to me. And you guys all have my email address because I sent you the Zoom link, but I will be sending this recording out, and then I'll also share Dr. Huesner's slides so that we all have access to those great charts. And I will also include the study that Dr. Huesner was talking about the timing of feeding horses, feeding the performance horse. And we also, I kind of just abbreviated a little bit in the previous edition of the Leading Rein. So if you guys have access to my quarterly newsletter, it's called the Leading Rein. We share a little bit about how to feed your performance horse and the timing and all of that in that edition. So does anybody have any questions? Feel free to type it in the chat box, and I will ask Dr. Huesner. You can unmute. That's totally fine too. Any sort of questions?
I probably just confused him.
No, that's okay. So I do have a question. What are your thoughts on like alfalfa cubes versus alfalfa hay?
Cubes are fine in my opinion.
Okay.
I would rather not feed cubes. I have always been a proponent of long stem hay. Like I said, I mentioned fiber versus forage, or fiber versus that. When I was in California, we had some problems because the forage was so good with horses developing vices, and people were feeding a lot of chopped hay, chopped alfalfa. Mm-hmm. When we increased the stem length on that chop, we helped alleviate some of those vices. In other words, one of the things that I didn't talk about, and again, you had me talk about something in an hour that I'm still, learning. It's a lifelong process. One of the things that we didn't talk about is the chew factor with horses. A horse that eats long stem forage, good quality forage, not necessarily the poor one that I showed you, has a chew factor. And what happens when they're chewing? They're producing saliva. And what does that saliva do? Besides adding digestive enzymes, it is a buffer. And why is that important? Because some of the behavior problems that we see in horses deal with the fact that down in the lower digestive tract, the hindgut, we alter the pH because a horse is not getting enough buffer or not getting enough fiber. So that chew factor to me is real important. And that's why I'm more of a proponent of, the horse was designed to be a grazer. We know that. And so the more they chew, the better. And I think, in my opinion, the limited data that's come out from different research, cribbers, horses that crib, horses that weave, a lot of times those are horses that are being fed maybe pelleted diets and maybe a chopped forage or even a pelleted forage. And again, with the cubes, um, I really haven't seen that much of a problem with the cubes. What we found when I was in California is that once the chop length is about an inch or a little bit longer, that helps a lot in the chew factor. It takes them a little bit longer to eat. So I don't know if that answers your question or put more confusion, but
No, that's good. That's good. So
that's my experience and that's what I'm sticking to.
perfect. We do have one question in the chat box. Emily said, you mentioned earlier that vitamin E was the one vitamin you would tend to see less of in a feed and hay. At what
No,
point?
yeah, I didn't mention, that's one that I would want to see more of in a feed.
Yeah.
Formulated feed.
So at what point would you consider adding in a vitamin E supplementation outside of the concentrated feed?
Oh, outside of a concentrated feed? I would consider it if you're seeing symptoms of a vitamin E deficiency, which that's going to be difficult to see. I think if in the concentrate feeds that have fat added, that might be a consideration. Or really in horses that are prone to tying up, those types of things, then I would consider a vitamin E supplement. We did a study. It wasn't with performance horses. We did a study while I was at the University of Georgia, where we were supplementing vitamin E to foals. We trained them to the point where they come up and just take the vitamin E out of your hand. And we actually showed they never had any problems. We wanted to see if we increased immunoglobulins in the horse, in the foal. So we wouldn't run into any foal problems. What we showed is that by we were supplementing 400 units of vitamin E a day, international units of vitamin E a day. And we showed an increase in immunoglobulins in those receiving the supplement versus those that didn't. So possibly, and now I'm just thinking out loud, never really had this question before. If you're doing a lot of traveling with these horses, going to a lot of different shows, a lot of different places, I might consider adding giving them a vitamin E supplement on top of what they're getting in their normal ration, simply because it does seem to improve immunity in these horses. And we all know what horses are exposed to when you travel to shows and different places like that.
Well, I know for like EPM treatment, a lot of times vitamin E is recommended at really high doses.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. As far as dosage level, normally I formulate, if I'm formulating a diet that has fat added to it, I may go up to 100 international units where the requirement is much lower than that. Where they're consuming maybe 100 international units per day.
Emily, hopefully that answered your question.